Well, it's that time again. More online macroeconomics. In this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about the other ill that sometimes plagues us during business cycles. So, in the last lecture, we talked about unemployment, which is one of the economic problems. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about inflation. Right? So, what is inflation? Well, inflation is a rise in general level of prices. All right. So we need a statistic, we need a measurement of price levels, and we use the CPI. You may have heard of this. I'm sure at some point in your lifetime you probably heard this say, the CPI was up 0.8% last quarter or last month or something, right? So the consumer price index. Well, what is the consumer price index? It's a market basket. So we take a collection of things that we need to buy of 300 goods and services. So what's in there, right? So we have some food, some energy, some education, some entertainment, right? So it's really a collection of, in general, what people need to buy, right? So the official definition of this is that it's a market basket of the 300 goods and services purchased by the typical urban consumer. So it's supposed to reflect the general spending habits of society, of individuals and households, right? So what do we use here, right? This typical urban consumer. Well, we update it every 2 years. In other words, if you think about the mix of output, right? We don't want 8 tracks in there, right? Because nobody buys 8 tracks anymore. So we need to put in there some type of digital music, right? And hardly anybody wears bell-bottom jeans anymore. So we have whatever the trend or the most popular type of clothing is there for the time being. Right? So to keep it up to date, they'll mix in or out highly similar goods that have replaced. I know we sort of talked about that when we talked about creative destruction anyway, with the way the economy works. Right? So here's the formula, the official formula, right? You take the price of the most recent market basket and price estimate of the market basket. The good thing is you're not going to need to calculate the inflation rate. So I'm not there's actually a couple problems with this in the textbook, but just understand that when we say the CPI, we're measuring the general price level in the economy and how much it's changed over time. Now, there's 300 goods and services in this basket. It's important that you identify the idea that it's a rise in the general price level. So if there's inflation, say last month or last quarter, it's nearly statistically impossible that all 300 goods and services are going up in price. That's probably not going to happen. It's probably never going to happen. What we're saying is that on average prices are going up. So maybe the price of 200 of those goods and services is going up. Maybe 50 of them didn't change, and maybe 50 of them are going down. But on average, prices are going up. Right? So it's a measure of the average price level in the economy. Well, we always start off by talking about inflation, but there's actually 3 things that could happen here, right? Things could happen. We can have inflation, which we just described. So we use the CPI and say, okay, if the prices of goods and services are 1.5% more expensive this year than they were last year, then we've had inflation in general price levels of 1.5%. Right? Now, deflation, which could also plague the economy. Matter of fact, the Federal Reserve was seriously worried about deflation at the beginning of this Great Recession. Right? And we're going to see when we look at some international comparisons of inflation rates over time that Japan has actually been plagued with deflation. So if inflation is an increase in the average price level, then deflation is a decrease in the average level of prices. And this can actually be a much more worrisome economic problem than inflation, right? Now the next one sort of seems like a conjured up economic term, which is exactly what it is. Disinflation, right? Which simply means, period of decrease in the level of inflation. And I put down some numbers here to make it, and I try to actually use a period of time when inflation was a problem, right? So if in 1977 inflation was 10% and in 1978 inflation was only 8%, price levels are still going up, but they're not going up as quickly as they were in the previous period. So we've had a period of disinflation. Right? So again, prices are still going up, just not as rapidly as they were in the previous period. So this is what we call disinflation. So here we have some data on the annual inflation rates in the United States going back to 1960 through 2007. And you can see that in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and early 80s, inflation really plagued the U.S. economy. But it's been, rather tame since then, especially since the 1990s. And a matter of fact, if we had the data on inflation rates since 2007, right, inflation's actually been extremely mild, right? Extremely mild. And we're going to talk about what causes inflation in a slide or two. And we'll talk about why inflation's been mild recently. So here we have some information about inflation rates for 5 industrialized countries. Obviously, the U.S., Italy, Germany, France, and Japan. Actually, since 1997, all of these countries have experienced a relatively mild inflation. If we could take this back a bit further, Japan's a country that's actually had the issue, as I spoke about earlier, with price levels. You notice that their price levels have actually been below zero, which means they've battled deflation, and that could be a serious economic problem, mainly because it sounds one of these good examples of the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition being, what's good for the individual is good for the group as a whole. Right, so that's a fallacy. What's good for the group, or what's good for the individual, is not good for the group as a whole. Generally speaking. So, for instance, if you go to the store and whatever goods and services you wanted to purchase are now priced lower, well, obviously, you're better off because your dollars are stretched further. But what happens when price level starts to drop is that the value of real assets tends to follow. So, in other words, the prices of homes and buildings, especially commercial buildings, starts to drop, and that becomes a problem because if you think about the leverage positions of banks, if banks have lent money to a corporation, we'll make up a fictitious corporation, say, ABC company bought a building. We'll use dollars, we won't use yens to keep it simple. If ABC company bought a building for $1 million and they financed it, they borrowed $800,000 to pay for it. Well, that's all well and good for the bank if the building's actually worth $1 million. But if the building's only worth, say, $650,000, then that company's in a negative debt to equity position, and that the bank is taking on huge risk because if ABC company defaults on their loan, right, the bank's not going to be able to sell the building for what they lent the company to begin with. And if you think about that happening across the nation, that's why deflation can be a serious economic problem. Right? If we could trace this out a little bit further, and the current slides don't have this, unfortunately, I looked. The United States inflation rates have actually come down quite substantially because of the Great Recession. So if we could, look at 2008, 9, and 10, inflation has not been an issue. As a matter of fact, it's averaged less than 2%, closer to 1% over that time period. All right, so there's generally speaking two types of inflation. Right, there's generally speaking two types of inflation, and we're going to explain the first type, demand pull inflation, and then in the next slide we'll talk about what's called cost push inflation. So here we have again, what's measured on your axis. Whenever you use a graph, be sure to identify what you are measuring on each axis. So on the vertical axis it says price level, but be careful here because when we studied supply and demand, we put P on the vertical axis, and that was the price of a specific good or service. It was an individual market. This price level is the price level in general, so the general price level of goods and services. So you can think of that almost as the CPI. Now, the CPI is not the only measure of price levels. You have the PPI, the Producer Price Index, right? You have the GDP deflator. There's all kinds of price indices that we generally just concern ourselves with the CPI because it's the most widely reported and it's the easiest to understand for introductory students. So on the vertical axis you have the price level. On the horizontal axis, notice we're simultaneously measuring two things: real domestic output, which is synonymous with GDP. All right, so our good friend GDP, gross domestic product, and then employment, the level of employment, or we could say measured by the unemployment rate. So as we move left to right on the horizontal axis, GDP is increasing, and as we produce more goods and services in general, the unemployment rate would come down. So as GDP goes up, in general, unemployment tends to come down. Right? What we have here is three ranges of a curve. Right? Range 1, sometimes called the horizontal range, sometimes called the Keynesian range, after economist John Maynard Keynes. And we're going to be studying John Maynard Keynes in the next week's lectures when we talk about some macroeconomic relationships and an important idea that he contributed to economic thinking called the multiplier. And he also contributed significant economic ideas associated with governments intervening in the economy when the economy sort of falters. So what's going on in this range 1? Well, the horizontal range of this curve is characterized by the following economic events taking place in the macro scheme. Right. First, there's absolutely positively no increases in price level across that range. So you can see on the vertical axis, the price level, since this curve remains flat, there's virtually no inflation across this range. So what's going on in the economy here is that there's a high degree of slack or excess capacity. Right. So in other words, we're in a recession, and the further left we are on this range 1 section of the curve, the worse the recession would be. So there's a high degree of slack excess capacity. Right. Many industries are operating, say, 30, 40, maybe even 50% below capacity utilization. Right. GDP, gross domestic product, would be negative. Right. Unemployment would be relatively high. Right. And there'd be absolutely positively no inflation. And the reason for this is because during a recession, there's not a tremendous demand for final goods and services because unemployment's high and people that have jobs aren't spending because they may be a little bit weary about, will they have a job 6 months or a year from now. So people tend to buy exactly what they need and nothing more, so that consumers, individuals, they're not bidding up the prices of final goods and services. And likewise, because businesses are by and large operating well below capacity utilization, there's not a huge demand for economic resources such as land and capital and labor. So the prices of these resources isn't being driven up either. Right? So range 1, well, eventually things start to improve, and we head into what's called the intermediate upward sloping range 2. So this range 2 is intermediate or upward sloping. Right? So what happens in this range is that economic activity starts to pick up a bit. So GDP turns from negative to slightly positive. Unemployment rate starts to drop a bit, and spending starts to occur. Right? Businesses start to spend on resources. Right? They start to hire back people that they may have laid off. They start to order more raw materials and other economic resources. So both on the consumer side and the producer side, there's a slight increase in the demand for goods and services and for resources. Therefore, there is a mild increase in prices of goods and services, a bit of inflation. Right? And we're going to approach what's called QF here, full employment. Now remember, we used this term earlier, full employment, when we were talking about the unemployment rate. Right, so we said there's 3 types of unemployment. There's frictional unemployment, there's structural unemployment, and there's cyclical unemployment. Right? Frictional and structural unemployment, they occur at all times. No matter what's going on in the economy, whether we're in an economic expansion or we're in a recession, there's always people who have voluntarily left their jobs and are frictionally unemployed. There's also people who have been put out of work because there's no longer the demand for the specific skill sets that they possessed, so they're structurally unemployed. Right? So we said that's roughly 5%. Right? That's roughly 5% unemployment rate. So an unemployment rate of roughly 5%, we'll say that's QF. Right? Any unemployment rate above 5%, that's all of that would be attributed to cyclical unemployment. Right? So notice that as we enter into this range 2, we first approach, and then we hit, and then eventually we surpass QF. So full employment output, and I'm going to use another way to explain this, full employment domestic output, meaning GDP within the United States here. Right? We're operating right about where we should be. So the 3 macroeconomic variables associated with full employment output would be the GDP. GDP is growing at our long run average at around 3%. Unemployment is somewhere very close to in the neighborhood of 5%, and inflation is somewhere around 2 to 2.5%. right? So that's our statistics at full employment domestic output. That's sort of the Goldilocks scenario. Everything's okay where we want to be operating. So we're in that nice phase of the economic expansion phase of the business cycle, right? So notice that as we first approach and then surpass QF, right, still in that range too, we can eke out a little bit more economic output past QF, but then look what happens in range 3, right? The curve turns completely vertical, right? It turns completely vertical. And think about our old friend, the production possibility frontier, right? The production possibility curve tells us our absolute limitations to production in the short run. Remember, in the short run, we have a fixed amount of resources and a fixed amount of technology, right? So we have an absolute positive limitation to economic production. So what happens is that through range 2, economic activity starts to pick up, right? Goods and services are being produced at a more rapid rate. GDP turns positive. Unemployment starts to come down. There starts to be some mild inflation, which is normal, the normal byproduct of a expanding economy. But then we're going to reach what's called the proverbial wall here. In the short run, right, and this is the best way to describe demand pull inflation, we could reach a situation where we have what's called too much money chasing too few goods. All right, so if spending for final goods and services continues to increase, at the same time producers bid up the price of economic resources, what's going to happen is no more GDP can be eked out, no more economic output will be produced. What simply happens is that prices tend to start to rise, right? So because we're at our full capacity of output, when the curve turns vertical, any increases in spending simply cause inflation, right? There's no more economic output associated with the increase in spending. So again, spending into and through that range 2, when we get into that range 3, the vertical range, right? Any increase in spending in range 3 by consumers on final goods and services and by producers on resources causes demand pull inflation. Okay, so now that we understand what we mean by demand pull inflation, too much money chasing too few goods, which typically happens at the peak of the business cycle, right? When we reach our temporary maximum of economic output, our full capacity output. There's another type of inflation. This one's actually more serious. This is called cost push inflation. So what happens if the price of a necessary resource were to spike up significantly, right? This is sometimes referred to as a negative supply shock, right? Cost push inflation. So it's related to input costs, right? And typically related to the price of oil. So here we have the exact same curve we studied in the previous slide with the 3 segments. So the horizontal range, the intermediate range, and the upward sloping range. So the horizontal range is sometimes called the Keynesian range. The intermediate range is the business cycle range, and the vertical range sometimes is called the classical range. Well, what happens if the price of oil goes up significantly? Right? If the economy experiences this negative supply shock, well, the entire curve is going to shift left, right? So we shift from AS1 to AS3, cost push inflation. Now, the reason why this is such a serious economic worry is because of this. If we were at full employment domestic output, so if the economy is operating at or where it could be or should be, with GDP growing at about 3%, unemployment at about 5%, and inflation about 2.5%, a leftward shift, a negative supply shock, right, caused by a significant increase in the price of oil, that's going to be bad for all 3 of our macroeconomic variables. In other words, GDP will turn negative because we're going to shift inward, so we move leftward on the horizontal curve. If we produce less goods and services, we're going to have unemployment associated with that because there's a recession associated with negative GDP. And like it says on the top of the slide here, cost push inflation, it drives up price level, right? It drives up the prices of goods and services, right? So this happened in the 70s with the oil embargo when OPEC cut supply of, specifically Iran, cut supply of oil to the United States, right? So this was significantly bad for global economy, specifically the United States. Now, the U.S. economy of the early to mid-late 70s and even the beginning of the 80s is quite different today than it was then. We're much less of a manufacturing-based economy than we were then. So some economists argue that we don't have the same risk for cost-push inflation as we did previously, right? However, a country like China, which is high into manufacturing and has been increasing demand for oil significantly over time, right? If they were forced to pay a higher price for oil, right, they would then experience this cost push inflation and would really have no other choice but to pass those higher prices on to the countries they export their goods and services. All right. So we always have a certain amount of inflation that we anticipate, 2.5% or so. All right. Now we're going to talk about okay, what happens when inflation occurs. Who's hurt? Who's helped by inflation? Right. So this nominal interest rate, real interest rate, right, inflation premium stuff. Let's bring all this stuff up and we can see it all at once and talk about it. Right. Nominal interest rate, somewhat similar to our good friend nominal GDP. Right. So if you think about it, if you get a car loan and it says you have a 5-year loan for 4%, so you borrowed for 60 months at 4%, or if you have a 15-year mortgage at 3.75%, or if you have a 30-year mortgage at 4.25%, the stated rate is the nominal rate, the rate at which you sign the papers, and it says on there your nominal interest rate. You sign the papers, so that's the stated rate, right? On the right there we have the inflation premium. So let's assume for a minute we're talking about a long-term loan, like a 20-year mortgage, right? So if the rate on the document says 4.5%, and inflation averages 2% over the course of that loan, your real rate of interest is then the difference between the two, right? So your real rate of interest is the difference between the two, right? So if your 20-year mortgage is 4.5% and inflation averages 2%, then your real rate of interest is 2.5, 2.5%. 4.5 minus 2, 2.5%. Right? Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, by going over this real rate of interest, we can sort of talk about who is hurt and who is helped by inflation. Right? Who's hurt and who's helped by inflation? Well, all right, let's bring up all these people who's hurt by inflation. Right? Let's talk about the last one first, creditors. In the last example, imagine if you're the bank and you lent money at 4.5%. But over the course of the loan, your inflation averaged 2%. So you're really only being paid back in real terms 2.5%. So inflation actually hurts lenders or creditors, institutions that lend out money, right? What about the group above that, savers? Imagine if you were a person who you bought a 20-year government bond, okay? Let's assume it was yielding 4.5%, just like the previous example. So let's say you bought a 20-year government bond. Let's say you bought $1,000 worth, right? So the way a government bond works is that you lend the money to Uncle Sam, and if it's a 20-year bond, right, every year for the next 20 years you're going to get 4.5%, right, or $45, right, on $1,000, right? And you're getting that return in nominal terms, right? You're getting that return in nominal terms. If inflation averages 2% over the course of that 20 years, you're really not getting back 4.5% because price levels going up. So what's happening there is because the prices of goods and services is going up over that 20 years, right? The purchasing power of your money is actually declining. So inflation is eroding some of your purchasing power. So inflation actually hurts savers, right? It hurts savers. So if you save at a fixed rate of interest. The last group here, this fixed income receivers. Imagine if it was like the good old days where you worked at a firm for, say, I don't know, 30 years. You worked at General Electric for 30 years, and you had a pension, and the pension was based on how many years of service, right? So let's say you were getting, let's say this is a nice round number here. You were receiving $2,000 per month, right? Well, GE is not going to renegotiate your pension based on increases in the price level, the general price level in the economy. So if there's any inflation, and definitely if there's significant inflation, right, the purchasing power of your $2,000 monthly pension is going to be eroded. In other words, your $2,000 is not going to be able to buy as many goods and services. So inflation definitely hurts fixed income receivers, right? Who is unaffected by inflation, right? Well, flexible income receivers, right? Sometimes we have this idea of what's called cost of living adjustment, right? So for instance, let's say you are on Social Security. Well, Social Security benefits are tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So in general, it might not be the exact amount, but if there's, say, 4% inflation this year, right, Social Security benefits would be adjusted upwards to reflect the now higher cost of living, right? Some union workers have COLAs, cost of living adjustments, built into their contracts. Now this can be a dangerous thing though, because in the early 70s, right before that period of significant inflation that we saw earlier on the previous slide, right, the auto unions, the UAW had negotiated a contract where there was a guaranteed increase in yearly earnings above the stated CPI. Right? But what happened was that inflation started averaging 8, 9, 10, 11%. So auto workers thought, hey, this is great because, the contract says that, it stipulates right there that automobile manufacturers have to pay us this amount above the CPI, above inflation. Well, the automobile owners, the companies, they responded by saying, we simply can't afford to give people 12%, 13% raises. Well, they had to by law because of the contract, but what they ended up doing was the automobile manufacturer just laying people off because significant increase in the price of labor there, right? So who's hurt by inflation? Who's unaffected? Well, who would be helped by inflation? Well, if you borrow money, you're actually helped by inflation. So in our previous example, we talked about the lender, right? The lender. And if you're the borrower, you're actually being helped by inflation, right? So debtors are actually helped by inflation, right? So it says there who is unaffected or not hurt by inflation. I think it's a better way to say is who is helped by inflation. So if you took out a 20-year mortgage at 4.5% on your home, and inflation averages 2% over the course of that loan, right? You're actually paying the bank back with dear money. In other words, right, the dollars you're returning to them 5, 10, 15 years down the road are worth less because of inflation than they were because of that 2% inflation has eroded some of the purchasing power. So borrowers are actually helped by inflation.